I really enjoy the songs that highlight God's forgiveness and love, and really kind of highlight the idea that this is a process, that you just don't have to come ready to go as is. And today, as we look to the Bible and what God would have for us, I actually want to take a little look at the process. Some of you were here 3 or 4 weeks ago. You might be familiar that Tim kind of alluded to this. I'll kind of catch everybody else up. But as we've been looking at the Bible, Tim took us to John, the first chapter of John. And if you remember, there were some guys that were following John the Baptist. And John, at one point said, hey, that fellow over there, Jesus, I didn't know this, but God told me that when I saw a spirit come down upon someone, that was the Messiah. Jesus, he's the one. And so those guys decided to follow Jesus from a distance. And Jesus kind of noticed, turns around and says, what do you want? And they're like, well, where are you staying? In other words, can we hang out with you? And he agrees, and Andrew's one of them. And in 1 John verse 40, it says that Andrew goes and gets Peter. And they have an encounter with Jesus. And then later on, remember, Tim took us to another passage in Matthew chapter 4, where it's talking about as Jesus was walking beside a lake, he looks out and he sees these same two brothers, Andrew and Peter, and he says to them, follow me, and they stop everything and they follow him. And you're like, didn't they already do that? Remember Tim mentioning that. There's actually a third instance. You can go in several passages, but I'll just start with Mark 3, where Jesus goes up on a mountainside and he prays all night, and then he comes together and he calls folks together, and he appoints, among others, Andrew and Peter as his disciples, as the apostles. So it can be confusing if you're like, is this all describing the same event? It's not. These are different places and different times, and it is a process. At the beginning, they come to Jesus and they're just kind of checking it out. They're just kind of there when they can be, and when they got to get back to work, they're back to work. And then at some point, Jesus gives them a specific invitation, and then later, he gives them a specific job, if you would, specific ministry. And so I want to talk a little bit about that process. We are in this series called Red. The reason we call it Red is because there's some Bibles that put Jesus' words actually in red, so you know, okay, focus on these because these are the ones that Jesus said. God speaks them all, so they're not more important, but it helps us just differentiate. Nothing else that makes the Bible more colorful. And so we're looking at some of those words, and this particular series that we're in is called Beginning. We take a good look at the first words that Jesus spoke, because when you're first starting your political campaign or your new job or you're leading this, that, or the other thing, kind of how you set the tone, where you're going to go, is really contained in your first words. And so we're looking at the first words of Christ. And the reason we call this beginning is because this is the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And actually, what we've been looking at, including today, are the words that Jesus spoke before he called the 12 disciples. If you're not familiar with that, I'll explain it here later. And so we're looking at this process of Jesus' first words, and the two words that I want us to focus on today are the words follow me. We read that in the Matthew passage. Follow me. And they're two very, very important words. It'd be easy in our culture, in our context, to kind of miss that. So let me give you a little bit of the historical background, some of my Jewish background, if you would. This is similar, by the way, to today in some degree, but it's very much reflects the way that Jewish boys and girls grew up in the first century in Jesus' time. The education system started around 5 years old with Beth Sefer. And Beth Sefer was when all the little 5-year-old boys and girls would gather at the synagogue, and usually the rabbi or some teacher would take them through the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament. To them, it was just the scriptures. Or they would call it the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And they would memorize. They'd learn how to read and write and memorize large portions, and in some cases, the entire those first 5 books. This would be about between the ages of 5 to about 10 years old. Kind of our elementary education would be Beth Sefer. Now, at this point, at 10 years old, truth is, most of those kids, almost all of the girls and most of the boys would go home. They'd be done with their education. They'd have a basic understanding of reading and writing. They'd have what's most important is they'd have an understanding of the laws of their community, which came from the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And the boys would go and do the trade that their father did or work for whoever their father worked for. And the girls would go home and they would learn how to take care of the household and garden and all those kind of things from their mom. But those who had great aptitude, they did really well, they understood the scriptures, they were the really good students, and those who could afford it. There are some that didn't have to go back and go home and practice the family trade. They would go on to the next level of education, which was Beth Midrash. And in this, again, it started around the age of 10. They would look at the rest of the Hebrew scriptures from Joshua all the way through the end of Malachi, along with the first 5 books. And they would just study it in depth, again, usually most of the time with the rabbi. This would end somewhere around the age of 15 or so years of age. And at that time, again, very few went on to Beth Midrash, but at that time, most of them would be done. The girls definitely would be done, and most of the boys were done as well. However, a few, if you would, not just the straight A students, but the cream of the crop students that really loved, understood, and had aptitude for the scriptures, they could dream of becoming a Talmud. Now, this is a little bit confusing to us. It's kind of like a lot of the English words that we have that have dual meanings. So, Talmud really means student, right? Tim told us that a few weeks ago. Talmud means student, means pupil. And so everybody in that community that went to the synagogue, we call church, synagogue on Saturday, because that was the day that they celebrated. It's from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday. They were all disciples. They were all Talmudim, is the plural. But within that larger group, there were some that a rabbi would select that would in essence be full-time students. So those who just kind of showed up, like you guys show up, let's say on Sunday, but within that, there would be a select few that would hope to become his full-time, kind of like if you would college or graduate school kind of a thing, that was more life on life than just attending school. And they would go to a rabbi. They thought that they qualified. They'd go to a rabbi and they would apply. They would say, can I be one of your Talmuds? And a rabbi would kind of, if he knew them, he'd kind of know right away. They probably pretty much knew before this time whether or not they should apply or not. But if the rabbi didn't know them, sometimes he would quiz them. He'd ask them questions about especially the Torah, the first 5 books, the books of the law, as well as some of the rest of the scriptures. He might ask about his life, his love for the Lord. He might even ask them, invite them to follow for a little while. And if the rabbi decided, you know what, this disciple can, and this is the term or the idea that they used, carry my yoke. And the yoke was the way that the rabbi approached the scriptures. The yoke was what the rabbi thought was the most important part of the scriptures. The yoke was the way the rabbi lived. If he felt that this person could live the way that he lived, think the way that he thought, and in essence someday become a rabbi of his own and teach others his ways, he would make the invitation often by going to that one who applied and say, follow me. And in those 2 words, those 2 simple words, follow me, was an unbelievable invitation, and B, though, it was also saying, I believe in you. I believe that you can become as I am. I believe you can understand the scriptures as I am. I believe you can have the kind of relationship that I have with God someday. The rabbi believes in you. And this is very much what Jesus affirms as well in his own ministry and life. In Luke chapter 6, he's teaching the disciples and he warns them, don't follow a blind guide because you'll both end up in the ditch. And then he says this in verse 40. He says, this is according to the complete Jewish Bible, because I want you to hear the Hebrew slant to it. Luke 6:40 says, a Talmud is not above his rabbi, teacher, but each one, when he is fully trained, what? Will be like his rabbi. What Jesus says is that the ultimate goal is that you become like the master, that you become like the rabbi. And it's all summed up in those two words, follow me. So for the rest of our time today, I actually want to go through the scriptures and look at that invitation and what Jesus says in context of what it means to follow me, to be one of his Talmuds, if you would. Now, this is all through the Gospels, because Jesus makes this invitation several places, but we're going to stick with just one book, but in your notes, you'll see where it shows up in the other writings as well. And so we're going to start in Matthew chapter 4, one that we kind of covered already in weeks past, read earlier. It says, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew, and they were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. So let me just paint the scene for you. These guys, on a time off from fishing, fishing either was really bad, it wasn't the season, for whatever reason, it was not time to fish. They went off to listen to a traveling rabbi that they heard about. His name was John. They called him John the Baptist because he was at Jordan baptizing people. And radically, he was one of these fiery preachers that young people especially liked, because he was railing against the religious folks, and he was railing against the government, and he was radically, he wore camel's hair and he ate grasshoppers, and young people love this kind of stuff. And so they went out to see him, but when they saw him, they introduced him to Jesus. And for a while, they checked out what Jesus was doing. And Jesus actually then traveled, it says, from the Jordan to where they live. But when they got back, it was time, they needed some money, and they went back to the family trade. And so Jesus is walking along. So he doesn't just show up on the scene here. He's not a stranger. They know who he is. They've listened to his teaching. They were his large group disciples. But as Jesus is walking by in this moment, as Jesus sees them out there, he says, verse 19, come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. At once, they left their nets and followed him. So if you don't understand the context, this doesn't make sense. Why in the world do they jump out of the boat? Especially the verses that follow this, two others leave their dad behind. Okay, but if you understand the context, it makes perfect sense. In today's context, from my Jewish roots, I can tell you this is generally true. If a Jewish mother's kid, or Jewish father's kid for that matter, gets a follow me letter from Harvard Law, full scholarship, full ride, they don't feel bad that they jump out of the boat and go. And in essence, culturally speaking, that's exactly what happens here. This is on that level. One of the great rabbis has chosen their kid. Now, there's something I want you to see here that's easy for us to miss. They're fishing. You know what that means? They're not the elite. As a matter of fact, later on, we'll find out when they're speaking boldly, but everybody around them, all the religious leaders around them that went through the education, you know how they refer to these fishermen? Unschooled fishermen. So chances are they went through Beth Sefer, but they probably didn't make it through Beth Midrash. But that doesn't mean that they're not hungry. They obviously are, because they went to see John the Baptist, but they're the B team at best. They only get in right when you're so far ahead you can't mess up the game anymore. And yet Jesus calls them. And what we see here in this, come follow me and I will make you fishers of men, we see an invitation, a process, and the result. The invitation is to follow. However, notice that the process is that Jesus is going to transform them. And that's really important. This is, by the way, why Jesus picks the B team. Right? Because the A team shows up saying, we can do it. The B team's like, we get it, we can't. And Jesus goes, good, follow me because I'm going to transform you. But notice the end result. The result of his call, the result of the process is that they are going to get, in essence, a new vocation. Fishers of men. In other words, they're going to call others. Now, this wouldn't be unusual in the Jewish mind and thought, because if a rabbi called you, he called you around, like I said, around the age 15 or 16, would be when the Talmud starts, and you would follow him for about the next 15 years until you're 30 years old. When you are 30, according to Jewish tradition, that is when you're able to teach. That's when Jesus' public ministry starts, by the way, when he's 30 years old. So their understanding is they're young men. We don't know exactly how old, but they're probably late teens, early 20s. And their understanding at this point is that when Jesus is done, they're going to call disciples. And in essence, they do. But one thing does change here that had not changed before. See, in the past, Jesus would have called Peter to be his disciple, and then Peter would have called somebody else to be Peter's disciple. But from this place forward, in essence, Jesus says, you will call disciples, but no longer will you call them for yourself. From now on, you, Peter, on down the line to you and I, call them still for Jesus. He is the last rabbi. He is the last teacher. Follow me. Jesus' invitation to follow me is not for the religious elite, but it is a vocational call. And I'm not saying that you quit IT, you quit being a mom, you quit whatever it is that you're doing and you become an evangelist. That's not what I'm saying. Because a lot of folks who took this call still did life. But amidst that life, they had a new center of their life. The center of their life was no longer just making ends meet. The center of their life was no longer just being a student at a school or whatever the case might be. The center of their life was no matter where they did life, they were to call others. That was their vocation. That was their life. Call others to Jesus. And that's the journey they set out to do. All right. Later on, Matthew chapter 8. Verse 18, it says, when Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gathered orders to cross the other side of the lake. Remember, he wasn't interested in just gathering a crowd. Then a teacher of the law came to him and said, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Now, again, this is huge, right? Because what we find out about this guy is he's already a teacher of the law. He's older than 30 years old. He's probably already made somewhat of a name for himself. And the fact that it doesn't just say he's a scribe is the one who meticulously copied the scriptures. A teacher of the law was one of the ones who understood and knew the scriptures the best and would interpret them for the everyday average person and how to apply it in life. He was an expert in the law, not our legal system law, but in the scriptures. And he comes to Jesus and he says, even though I'm older than 30, even though I've already been through this process before, I will become one of your Talmids. Now, it seems like this is awesome. This is a great honor for Jesus. But Jesus kind of looks in and he replies, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. What's going on here? Because of Jesus' response, it's pretty easy to assume that what the teacher of the law was thinking is this. He was thinking, you know what, I have a pretty good resume. I'm putting it in modern day terms. I have a pretty good resume. But if I were to study under this guy, I could go anywhere. They would take me. Because this guy's fame spreading all over. If I had to work for this company, then everybody will hire me. It's the same idea. In other words, this is my meal ticket. And Jesus says, hold on. This is what you need to understand about following me. Your name's not going to get bigger. You're not all of a sudden going to start eating better and getting more money because I don't even have a place. There's no place I call home. And most of the time, we camp outside. We're camping along the road. It's dangerous. It's not the woohoo that you think it is. And then another guy comes along. Another disciple said to him, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. So the assumption here is Jesus has given him an invitation. And he says, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. But Jesus told him, follow me. There's the greatest invitation. And let the dead bury their own dead. Now, this disciple isn't saying, Jesus, I won't follow you. What he's saying is this. He's saying, Jesus, it's not a convenient time. Now, most writers believe that this guy's dad's probably not dead. What he's saying is, I still got a father to take care of. I have an estate to settle. Let me wait until my father passes, and then I'll get there. Right? It's kind of like many of us are saying, you know what? I just need to get this job promotion. I just need to get my kids to do this. I just need to get over this crisis in my life. And then, God, I'll have time for you. And Jesus says, no. I've got to be the conviction of your heart. There's no other way. I have to be the conviction of your heart. And then when he says, let the dead bury the dead, there's something in the language there that it could also be taken, let those who are spiritually dead take care of those who are spiritually dead. In other words, you got to care more about your soul, about God's kingdom than your kingdom. Let those who are worried about 401ks and upward mobility and the latest toys, let them worry about that. You need to be following me. See, Jesus' invitation to follow me is not about blessing or convenience, but a conviction that results in sacrifice. Yes, I said it. Yes, I said it. Now, sometimes you are blessed when it's convenient. But understand the heart of Jesus' call. He does not guarantee blessing, nor is he calling you to ultimately bless you. I apologize for brothers and sisters who mean well, that kind of sell Christianity underneath that banner. I just remind you that Jesus and all his disciples end up dying for what they believe. Next passage. Matthew chapter 9. This is Aaron's fault. She prayed for boldness. So, Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, as Jesus went on from there, so he's teaching, he's traveling, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. Now, again, let me just kind of paint, just in case you don't know, let me paint a context for you, okay? Using modern day. Imagine you're a Muslim living in Jewish-occupied West Bank, and your job is to collect money from other Muslims to give it to the Jews. How well do you think you're liked? This is Matthew's job. He's a Jew living in Roman-occupied Jerusalem area, but his job is to collect money from the Jews to give it to the hated Romans, who by the way, make ISIS look not so bad. Sometimes we forget context. He says, follow me. And Matthew, notice his response, got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. Sinners is like the worst of the worst. Whatever you want to think, prostitutes, thieves, whatever. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? He's supposed to be a religious leader. How can he hang out with those kind of people? On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. And he quotes Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. Interesting enough here, Matthew, who is a sinner, that's a crowd he hangs out with. So he feels more comfortable with the thieves. He feels more comfortable with those who skip out on church. He feels more comfortable with those who are very far from God than those who regularly attend synagogue, or in our case, church. That's his crowd. The religious, not so much. But for some reason, being that kind of person doesn't disqualify him. Jesus says, follow me. Notice Matthew's response, though. He gets up immediately and he follows Jesus. That's what makes him qualified. Plus, he has his heart is to share this experience with his friends. I mean, can you imagine? Just imagine that conversation. Can you imagine Matthew going to his friends saying, you got to meet this religious leader, Jesus. And they're like, Jesus, I've heard of Jesus. He's one of those, rabbis, and everyone's talking about him, and he's teaching some awesome things about the scriptures, and he's healing people. He must really be from God. And Matthew says, yes, he asked me to follow him. And they look at Matthew and go, what? He doesn't know you, does he, Matthew? He doesn't know your life. Does he know that you hang out with us? Does he know that most of your friends are just out of prison? Does he know, that you have tattoos, and does he know that you smoke cigars, and does he know whatever stereotype you want to throw in there? And Matthew goes, yes. And guess what? I'm throwing a party, and he wants all you guys to come. They're like, what? Is this the same Jesus, Rabbi, yes. Yes. See, Jesus' invitation to follow me is not for the morally upright, but it is for those who want to be made right. I didn't come for those who are already there. I didn't come for those that, if you, in essence, were born with a silver spoon in their mouth and they can provide for themselves. I came for those who understand and know I ain't right. I've never been right. I wasn't raised right. I'm every which way but wrong, but I'd like to be right. I would. The problem is my junk and my brokenness is so big, it's so heavy, I don't see any way up. And when I take a step up, everybody reminds me of my past, and I just end up down. But Jesus says, if you want to be made right, follow me. Matthew 10 actually isn't a follow me passage. Matthew 10 is when he calls his 12 disciples to him and gives them authority to drive out evil spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. And then he names the 12. The reason I bring this up is this. Jesus has called disciples to follow him. Some of them are the 12, but he's called other people to follow him as well. In Matthew 10, he calls the group together, all those that are either generally following him or he specifically said, follow me. And among them, he picks 12 to have the special ability to do some miracles, and also ultimately to grow and to teach others and to be the leaders of the movement. But the call to follow me, the promise to I will transform you, the goal of you're going to be a fisher of men, or you're going to call others to me, that goes to every disciple before chapter 10. You got to understand that, yeah, there's something special about that 12, but that doesn't exclude you and I. Jesus' invitation to follow me is not just for prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. It's not just for the guy or gals on the stage. It's for anybody who answers that call, who has that desire to follow Jesus. Matthew 16. The context here suggests that Jesus is not just teaching the 12. It comes out of a specific conversation with the 12, but he's teaching all his disciples that are there. And he says this, starting in verse 24, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me will find it. What good will it be for a man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? In other words, who cares if you're a billionaire? You can't buy your soul back. Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man, that's also can be read Messiah, is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels. And then he will reward each person according to what he has done. I tell you the truth, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And in essence, there's 3 in the very next chapter that see Jesus glorified and who he really is. But I want to go back to verse 27 there. He says, Jesus will reward each person according to what he's done. What's the doing? It goes back to the very first thought. The doing is deny himself, taking up a cross, and following Jesus. People will be rewarded based on that. To deny oneself is a trade-off, right? We try to do this all the time, right? You try to do the trade-off of, I want that eclair, or I want those French fries, or I want that. The trade-off is, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips, versus saying no and being healthier. The trade-off of not spending the money every time the newest whatever comes out, right, is the trade-off is a less of a debt load, more peace of mind. And he says the first step, if you want to be a follower of his, there's a trade-off. You must trade off some of the things you love. You must deny yourself. You must deny yourself. And then he says, take up this cross. Now, this has got to be weird because for you and I, the cross is a symbol of love. It's a symbol of Christ. But the time he says this, he hasn't been to the cross, and no one expects him to go there. They all, by the way, expect a throne to be in his future on earth. So when he says take up his cross, what they do know this is it's something that they don't even speak among the Jews. It's a horrendous thing that the Romans made up just for Jewish people, or actually not just Jewish people, anyone they occupied to set them straight. It was just used a lot on the Jews because they're so stubborn. And what they would do is the cross is slowly suffocating somebody, but they had to have a beam, and they often would make them carry their beam through the crowds to the place that they were going to suffocate them. And so when he says take up your cross, what he's saying is this: the journey will be hard. And then he says follow me. In other words, if you're going to follow me, I'm going to tell you right up front, the trade-off is you got to give up some self. And I'm telling you right now, it's going to be hard. And then I want you to do is follow me. In other words, Jesus is the focus, Jesus is the direction, and Jesus is the end result. It's about him. Summary, Jesus' invitation to follow me is not about success in this world, but being willing to suffer in this life because you're convinced of reward in the next. Jesus' words, not mine. Last passage, Matthew chapter 19. Starting in verse 16. Jesus is teaching, people are coming, they're learning from him, and it says, verse 16, now a man came up to Jesus and asked, Teacher, what good thing must I do to get eternal life? Now we don't know for sure, but knowing the culture and the context, this young man probably has gone to several rabbis and asked this question. It's a very common thing to ask questions of the rabbi and to kind of start this kind of discussion. Some of the questions too, like, what do you think the greatest commandments are? Or how would you sum up the Hebrew scriptures? It's a common discussion. And so he asked a common question, and by the way, a really good one. I mean, if you're searching out God, no matter what religion you're looking into, one of your fundamental questions should be, how do I get to the good stuff? How do I get reincarnated? How do I, move up the reincarnation ladder? Or how do I enter in nirvana? Or how do I get to heaven? Or how do I, whatever it may be, that should be a fundamental question you should ask. And so as a Jewish young man, he goes to Jesus and he asks this question. How do I get eternal life? The end result. And Jesus replied, verse 17, why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good. Now, he's going to remind him here that truly the standard is to keep the law, everything, and to always be good. In other words, we all come up short, young man. You know that. And then Jesus says, if you want to enter life, obey the commandments. Now, interesting, this man says, which ones? In other words, Jesus, I know that, yada, yada, yada. Don't give me generalities. Which ones? Now, you would expect Jesus to say, well, all of them, of course. But he doesn't. What's interesting is that Jesus replies, and he says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, honor your father and mother. Now, some of you may recognize those. Those are from the 10 Commandments. What's interesting is they're commandments that Jesus doesn't give. One of the most glaring ones is that these are all focused on people. He doesn't give love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, keep the Sabbath. He doesn't do this relationship. He says this relationship. The only one he leaves out in this relationship is coveting, which is internal. He gives all the external things that people could actually see. Keep those commandments. See, now you got to understand. See, Jesus knows what's going on. And then he adds one from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that interesting? He mentions those out of the 10 Commandments that have to do with relationship. And then his summary one is love your neighbor as yourself. And then the man responds, all these I have kept. What do I still lack? In other words, as far as everybody can see, I do all these things. Now, what's interesting is not only did he declare that, but he says, what do I still lack? That's telling us something. What it's telling us is he feels there's something lacking. In one of the other accounts of the same story, it actually says, when this man responds to Jesus, it said Jesus had compassion on him. See, I think Jesus looks into this young man's life and he goes, this guy is zealous for God. He's faithfully gone to synagogue. He's learned under a rabbi. He knows the scriptures, but there's a hole in his heart. There's something missing. He's like, I'm doing all this religious activity. I'm going to church. I even did Bible study fellowship, but there's something missing. There's a hole. Jesus, what more do I have to do? I think there's desperation there. And Jesus answered, if you want to be perfect. Now, he's not talking about perfect. He's saying, you want to fill that hole? You really want to achieve your goal? Go. Sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. When the young man heard this, he went away sad. Why? Because he had great wealth. Now, in the previous passage, when Jesus said, generally to his disciples, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. If you ask the question, Joel, what does that practically look like? Here's the practical application. Deny yourself. Sell everything you own. Take up your cross. Give it to the poor. Then follow me. Jesus somehow looks into the soul of this young man, and he understands the problem is there's a lot of religious activity, but fundamentally, the love your neighbor as yourself, that all those rules point to, the heart of love, the heart of seeing value in people, the heart of mercy over sacrifice, this young man misses. And so he gives him the litmus test for him. Now, it's really important. You can read Matthew chapter 19 after this story. Maybe it's in Luke. But there's a story that Jesus encounters Zacchaeus right after this. And Zacchaeus gives only half of everything he owns, and Jesus praises him. So the issue is not some socialism, sell everything. That's not the issue. But Jesus looks at the heart of this young man and says, you have a fundamental issue. You are religious, but you don't really love. You don't really believe. You're not really ready to follow. Litmus test, let me expose your heart. Sell everything you have. And then don't just give it to the church. Give it to the poor. Give it to the uneducated. Give it to the sinner. Give it to, and it exposes his heart. That's Jesus' point. Jesus' invitation to follow me is not just about doing good, but doing good out of love for others, which, by the way, is why he needs to transform us. That's not something you just force yourself into. decide you're going to do. It's a vocational call, following Jesus. It's a conviction that results in sacrifice. It's for those who want to be made right. We're not there, but we want to be made right. And we're willing to suffer in this life because we're convinced of the reward and the relationship in the next. And it comes from the heart of love, from the inside out. It is not religious. Now, it would be easy to kind of be down on ourselves, because if I were to graph this, right, our temptation is, if the top of the line is good thoughts and deeds and the bottom of the line are bad thoughts and deeds, it's like to follow him means I'm going to give up everything, and it's a perfectly straight line. Only Jesus has that line. And we know this. We know next graph that it looks more like this. Sometimes you do well, sometimes you not do so well, right? But the hope is, we innately know that the hope is, the trend line. These trend lines, even though it's up and down, the trend is up. So at least maybe we're doing better than we used to do when we were a teenager, rather than the reverse, graph. None of us want our graph to be where the trend line is down. And that's our basic belief. When you stand before God, the trend line's basically up, you're in. If it's basically down, you're out. But here's the thing. In terms of good thoughts and deeds, everyone's trend line is down. Everyone. And as you grow older, it's not like your trend line goes up, because as you grow older, even though you didn't do the bad you used to do, you find out more stuff about yourself, and there's more bad you're discovering. Right? And as Tim pointed out to us, it's not just what you do that you shouldn't have done, but it's what you didn't do that you should have done. Jesus took care of that, but there is a trend line. The trend line is towards Jesus or towards self. See, you could do a lot of good. See, religion measures things by good and bad. Jesus' call to follow me is not that. It measures your decisions by, is it Jesus-focused or self-focused? Because you can do a lot of good, like this rich young ruler, but it's ultimately selfish. The question is, where are your eyes? And this is true generally, but specifically, I drive a motorcycle. And your motorcycle goes where your eyes are. Your motorcycle goes where your... I've never been tempted to text and drive on my motorcycle. When you're turning a corner, you don't look in front of you on a motorcycle. You look about 20, 30 feet ahead to where you want your bike to end up in about a second or two. And amazingly, your bike ends up there. It's the same thing. The essence of this is put your eyes on Jesus. When you're at school, put your eyes on Jesus. When you're mothering and fathering, put your eyes on Jesus. If you're in church, don't put your eyes on this guy or that beautiful young lady who stands over there. Put your eyes on Jesus. When you're lying down and you're getting up and you're going to and you're going fro, put your eyes on Jesus, and that is where your life will go. Because that's ultimately Jesus' invitation. Follow me. Let me pray for us. Father, Dad, I thank you. I thank you that you didn't go with those who are smart, who are mostly good. But when you look down at humanity that you created, you saw broken, fallible, self-absorbed people. You chose us. You chose me. And I pray, Lord, I pray that we may hear that call. And our first response will be a thankfulness, dear God, that you chose us. But then amidst that the things that we grab onto in terms of our identity, the things that we look to may begin to fade away. And our eyes more and more lock onto you. That you may do that good work in us and through us. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.